Hi, I'm Nate Bronner with the Virginia Cooperative Extension and the Master Gardener Program, and I'd like to welcome you back to my garden. Today I'd like to talk to you about tomatoes. Now, tomatoes are some of the most popular uh, vegetables to grow in a vegetable garden, and for good reason. They taste great, they go with a lot of different things, and they're very nutritious. So most people like picking their tomatoes and getting them into the garden. I'd like to share with you some of my tips for how to make yourself an even more successful gardener with tomatoes than you might already be. The first thing I'd like to talk to you about is how to pick the right tomato. Now, of course, if you find a tomato that you love based on taste, that's the one you ought to be growing. But there's a lot of different varietals out there. There's hundreds, even thousands of different types of tomatoes. And if you go online to a number of seed or gardening retailers, they will have a whole list of hundreds on their website that you can choose between. How do you choose the right one for you? Well, the first thing you need to know about is some of the nomenclature about the tomatoes. Lots of times, the two biggest categories that they'll be separated into are determinate and indeterminate. Determinate tomatoes set all of their fruit at the same time, and they grow in more of a bush shape. Whereas indeterminate tomatoes grow in a vine and they keep growing the whole season long, and they produce fruit or vegetables over the entire season. So if you want cherry tomatoes to keep on producing all season long, you want to get an indeterminate tomato. Then you need to know what size of tomato you want. Do you want a paste tomato like a Roma tomato? Do you want a beefsteak tomato, a big hunk of one that you can take slices and put on your sandwich or on your burger? Or do you want cherry tomatoes that you can just pick off the vine and pop in your mouth and they taste so great? Those are some of the decisions that you need to make. A couple of years ago, when I was new to York County, a little over a decade ago, I started growing tomatoes here like I always do, and I started finding that my tomatoes weren't doing very well. And when I looked into it and I had Virginia Tech test the tomatoes that had been failing, I found out that my tomatoes were suffering from Fusarium wilt. It's a common disease that affects tomatoes in our area. I knew that in the future, if I wanted to grow tomatoes and be successful, I should pick varietals that were resistant to Fusarium wilt. How do I do that? Well, if you look on most tomato packages or on the websites, lots of tomatoes will have some capitalized letters at the end of the name. In this case, one of my favorite varietals is the Sweet Chelsea cherry tomato. At the end, you'll see that it has some capitalized letters that read TMVFN. Those refer to the disease resistance of this particular variety. It's been bred for disease resistance. In this case, tobacco mosaic virus, Fusarium wilt, and root nematodes. And these should be not immune to it, but much more resistant than your standard tomato. So I tend to use these along with other tomatoes in my garden. Makes it a lot easier to be successful. Another thing that I do when I'm planting my tomatoes is I am concerned about blossom end rot. For that, I need to make one of the ways that you prevent that is by having enough calcium in the soil. And an easy way to have extra calcium in the soil are chicken egg shells. It's pretty easy. I just crush them up after we're done using them, and I put them in the bottom of the hole where I'm going to be planting my tomato. It doesn't take a whole lot. I put them at the bottom there, and then they slowly leach their calcium into the soil, and I avoid blossom end rot. Now, most plants, when you plant them in the garden, you want to plant them at you want the plant to be at the same level in the garden that it was in the pot that you took it out of. You don't want to plant it up high, and you don't want to plant it way down low and then pile the dirt around the stem of the plant. Tomatoes are different in that regard. Tomatoes like being planted far down in the garden. They like planted way down in the soil because they will set out roots all the way up and down their stem here, and that will help it with its drought resistance. So on those hot summer days when you don't water maybe as much as you want it to, it can still get in all the water and the nutrients that it needs to grow big, tall, and strong. To do that, I simply pinch off the lower leaves before I plant it, and I'm going to plant it down in the soil. I'm going to plant it very deep in the soil. Now, I could also turn it on its side and gently twist up the end of it. That would also help and would expose more of the plant to the soil and allow it to grow more roots. But if you can see, it grew out right here in my pot, and now it's going to be buried down to about here when I put it into the soil. I just put it all the way down into the soil like this. It's nice and deep in there, and then I just push the soil back in there on top of it, and it is just going to be very happy here in the soil. And even pinch off this one lower leaf and encourage it to grow more roots all the way up and down its stem. And there you go, it's planted in there. It's going to do quite well. Now, these tomatoes that I have here that I grew in my from seed, I started those back on March 9th. It's about 5 weeks later, and actually they've gone a little bit long. I've been waiting to make this video for a while. So they're a little bit taller than I had planned on, but they're very ready to go in the garden, and they're going to do really well at this point. Sometimes these tomatoes, I put them in the garden, and they start growing up, and they will set lots of fruit in the spring, and then people wonder why their vegetable production tapers off in the middle of the summer. And the simple answer to that is that when it gets too hot, tomatoes cut back on the amount of fruit or vegetables that they're producing. So once the nighttime temperatures get too far above 70 degrees, they don't like producing as much fruit, and they'll cut back on that. In the fall, once the temperatures drop back down at night, they'll start producing fruit again. So in our area, you can expect the tomatoes to produce very strongly in the spring and the fall, and a little bit less so in the summer, but they'll still keep producing vegetables. When you plant it in the ground, you want to make sure that you give it plenty of water. Now, I have my raised bed set up with drip irrigation that gets the water exactly to the tomato where it needs it, and make sure it gets just the right amount of water to it. You want to make sure that you water very deeply your tomatoes. Tomatoes are one of those plants that you cannot overwater. They just love water. Actually, you can overwater them, but I'm trying to make a point here. It's very difficult to overwater your tomatoes, so give them plenty of water. In the beginning, when they're like this, they don't need a whole lot of support. Later on, when they start growing up and getting bigger, you have some support, different options for your support. And in about a week, I'm going to post another video that talks to you about my techniques for how I stake up my tomatoes. And here's a here's a little bit of a preview of that. I don't use those tomato cages that you can get at most garden stores. They last for about until the tomato gets to here. And once they get to a full-grown tomato, and this tomato will grow up to 7 or 8 feet tall, they'll be useless for that. So I come up with another system, and I'll talk to you guys about that a little bit later. But one of the things I wanted to talk to you about now are these PVC pipes that you see right here. I put these over it so I can cover my raised beds, like I have this one covered right here, and it turns it into a mini greenhouse. I use 10-foot sections of PVC pipe. I bend it over in hoops. I attach it at the bottom with pipe straps, and then I drape horticultural fabric over it. You can get it at most garden centers or online retailers, and that helps turn this raised bed into a mini greenhouse. So it keeps it a little bit more humid, a little bit warmer inside, and helps these warm season plants get a little bit of an extra start on the year when temperatures in April can fluctuate a lot. They can get down pretty close into the 40s, and we don't want that to happen. That might shock our plants a little bit. So I make sure that I give them a little bit extra, just like I am right here. I've got some cucumbers back here and some zucchini that are planted in here, along with dill. I do companion planting, and those are growing up much faster in here than they would if I didn't have this cover on it. And on nice days when it's really good, it can get too hot in there, so I take that cover off and let them enjoy that rich sunshine. Those horticultural fabrics come in various thicknesses. The thicker they are, the less light, the less rain, the less air that they let through, but they all are permeable to water and air and sunshine. So you can choose it depending on the amount of protection that you want to give to your plants. The other thing I wanted to talk about is you can see the pepper plants here and they're growing quite well. One thing I always plant with my tomatoes is basil. Not just because I like eating the two of them together, but this is called companion planting. And studies have shown that when you plant basil with tomato, they share the nutrients in the soil, and the nutrients that one both uses and then produces in the soil are used by the other one, and they both grow much hardier and get increased fruit production. So if you want that with your tomatoes, make sure you plant some basil next to it, and then let that grow on up. Those are the basics for the tomatoes. I'm going to leave a link at the end of this to a Virginia Tech publication where you can go on and learn more. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below. And thanks for coming back to another edition of In the Garden.